When did you get back, Shonda?
Last Thursday, I think.
Okay.
Last Thursday. What's today? Yeah.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining. Just gonna wait a few minutes. Looks like people are coming in. Hope you all had a good past couple of weeks since our last training. And today we are very excited. This is in honor of National Black HIV/AIDS Awareness Day and Black History Month. We have the esteemed Dean of the Divinity School, Dr. Jonathan Lee Walton, who is here at Wake Forest University. And he is trained as a social ethicist, focusing on evangelical Christianity. His work and insights have been featured in several national and international news outlets that range from New York Times, CNN, Time Magazine, ESPN, and the BBC. His latest book, A Lens of Love, Reading the Bible in its World for Our World, explores the Bible from the perspective of the most vulnerable and violated characters. Its aim is to underscore a tradition of Christian witness that privileges radical inclusion and social justice. He is the author of the Watch This, The Ethics and Aesthetics of Black Televangelism. Watch This examines the impact of evangelical religious broadcasting on African-American religious and political thought. Dean Walton earned his Doctor of Philosophy and Master of Divinity degrees from Princeton Theological Seminary. He served as the Plummer Professor of Christian Morals and Pusey Minister in the Memorial Church at Harvard University prior to his appointment at Wake Forest University. Along with serving as the Dean of the School of Divinity, Professor Walton also occupies the Presidential Chair in Religion and Society and is the inaugural Dean of Waite Chapel at Wake Forest University. Dean Walton is married to Cicely Klein, a children's book author, and they are the parents of 3 children, Zora Neal, Elijah Mays, and Baldwin Klein. Thank you, Dean Walton, for joining. Before Dean Walton begins his talk, we are going to launch a poll that we ask everyone to take. This poll gives us a sense of where you are currently with your knowledge on the topics that will be covered today in the training. And then we will also launch a poll at the end of the session to also gain a sense of where you are after you've heard from his talk to assess your improvement in knowledge. These polls help us to kind of get a sense of where we are with the work that we're doing and get some feedback from you all. And so please make sure to take the survey, and I believe we'll also be sending you a link to a longer survey. Is that correct, Demi? To get some additional feedback. So please help us out by completing this survey. So take it away, Dean Walton.
All right. Well, let me just begin with I'm sorry, I might have ended your poll trying to get it off of my screen.
No,
I'm
it's
sorry
still
if I
going.
did.
You're fine.
Oh, it's still going. Okay, all
Yeah.
right. Listen, thank you. Sincere expression of appreciation for the members of the Faith Coordinated Center at Wake Forest, supported by the Compass Initiative of Gilead Sciences. I mean, our mission at Wake Forest School of Divinity is to foster agents of justice, reconciliation, and compassion. It's to train architects of equity, hope, and healing. I mean, not just among the students who are enrolled in our degree programs, but We want to be a resource for all who are committed to the heavy lifting of human services and social healing animated by our faith. And toward this end, the Compass Initiative and the Faith Coordinating Center is one of our premier programs. I mean, their work in helping ministry and nonprofit leaders, like many of you, helping to support vulnerable populations disproportionately impacted by HIV and AIDS, encapsulates and conveys our mission of pro humanitate, for humanity. So therefore, I just want to celebrate the executive director, Allison Matthews, Dr. Shonda Jones, Demi McCoy, and Marcus Hawley, and Diane Cox, and all of you on this call today. For you are the true heroes and the spiritual warriors fighting structural injustice. You are the ones combating health inequity, transforming narratives from exclusion to inclusion. And thus you are the ones who are saving lives. And so I'm the one who's really honored to be here with you today. I'm going to share my screen. And I am going to invite you to thumbs up if you can see. Wonderful. I'm going to invite you to pull out your cell phones or laptops or iPads and log in to menti.com. And you can access this with the code that's at the top, 2489-2484. Because there's just a couple of exercises that I want to start with today. I give everybody just a second to do it. First, I don't want anybody to think too hard, but I just wanted to put some beautiful images up, or at least what I consider to be beautiful images. And then in 3 words, I'd ask you to respond. What do you see? What do you see? All right. Dignity. Solidarity, but strength, men, unity, power, community. All right, they're still coming in. Strong Black men. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's 1968. Sanitation workers in Memphis on strike. Going to move to another one. Thank you for these responses. March on Washington for jobs and freedom. Principally organized by a beautiful Quaker brother named Bayard Rustin, who just doesn't happen to be in this photograph. But similarly, what do you see? Determination, togetherness, strength, power. Mm. Mm. Wonderful. Thank you. Obviously, for those that are the largest, those that are in the center are the most common responses, the shared responses. Got another one for you. I don't know if y'all can hear this. Can you hear it, Allison, or no?
No, we cannot.
You don't need to be able to hear it though. So it is beautiful to hear because we get to see this beautiful man singing Love TKO, Teddy Bear. Think about what you see. Boy Pentecostal preacher out of Philadelphia. Started off his career as a pulpit playing drums in a Pentecostal church before he started playing drums for Harold Melvin and the Blue Notes. And of course became lead singer, in some ways displacing the voice of even the great Harold Melvin until he goes solo. When you saw Teddy Bear singing, and those of you who know Love TKO, what do you see when you Mm. Passion, love, power, soul, confidence, sexy, love. I noticed something in the 3 different images and our responses to these images. It's something that I'll come back to a little bit later, but for the most part, they were all understandably so, as are mine. My responses, my initial responses to them are for the most part positive. Like when I look at Teddy Bear, right? I see passion, I see confidence, see power, I see strength, I see desire. But central to the work of changing the narrative is also sometimes changing the perspective about what we see and or about what we presume, what we take for granted. If we, for instance, want to dismantle white supremacy, if we want to dismantle white supremacy in America and across the globe, then we have to interrogate prevailing assumptions, categories, stories, and belief systems that will render whiteness normative. When something, anything, is the norm, it's a standard, we take it for granted. And when we take something or anybody for granted, it just becomes always and already. And when something becomes always and already, it becomes the default template from which everything else is judged. And therefore, that becomes the power of privilege. Consider how even the category of race is used in our society. When the average person says, let's have a conversation about race in America, that typically means what? Let's talk about Latinx, African Americans, those of African or Asian descent. Rarely does it mean, when somebody says, let's have a conversation about race in America, rarely does it mean, let's interrogate the logics of white Anglo-Saxon Protestantism. Let's talk about European immigration. Let's talk about colonialism. Let's talk about imperial domination. These things usually just fade to the background. Again, a certain taken for grantedness. This is why some people believe that we can be, for instance, a post-racial society without being a post-racist society. Or some people will say, if some of y'all would stop talking about color or stop harping on race, then it wouldn't be such an issue. Or that common refrain that we all love to hate, when I see you, I don't see race. As if my Blackness needs to be negated in order for you to see my humanity. Again, if whiteness is normative, if it's the standard for humanity, then white people are afforded the privilege of not thinking about themselves as racialized Americans. And we are all relieved of the fact that race as a social construct is actually predicated on the creation and presumption of superiority of this thing called whiteness born of the Enlightenment. We're relieved of that burden. We don't have to deal with that. We don't have to talk about that. We don't have to talk about the Enlightenment justifying logics of European conquest and or the Enlightenment reinforcing varying forms of domination. To paraphrase James Baldwin, describing Jim Crow in America, he said, people call the race problem in America the Negro problem. Well, James Baldwin said segregation isn't the Negro problem. I didn't create it. And I don't have a problem eating or living wherever I choose. It's white people who have the problem because they have a problem with the Negroes eating or living wherever they choose. So to dismantle white supremacy, then, we must interrogate the histories, the narratives, the stories that render whiteness as always and already smart, bright, and always right. Well, the same is true from the perspective of gender and sexuality. For too many of us, the term gender and sexuality only refer to women and those who are same gender loving, respectively. Too often, we don't think about men as gendered subjects. To have a gender or to be gendered means that you're a woman. To be a man, more notably a heterosexual man, is the normative baseline for humanity. From a theological perspective, one might say that it's being a man is the ground of all being. It's the divine image. Which is, of course, ironic because we spend so much time in our society privileging rites of passage discourse around teaching boys how to become men, particularly in African-American communities. There's a cultural script to manhood. And that's what I want to spend this training unpacking. I want to interrogate and thus demystify what has become a canonical cultural symbol in African-American communities of faith. This quote unquote, strong Black man. Whether as represented in the first image we saw of striking sanitation workers, holding up signs, I am a man, whether it's Martin Luther King Jr. and his male clergy colleagues showing great resilience and resolve, or whether it's somebody like this iconic emblem of Black masculinity, Teddy Pendergrass. So what am I talking about? By strong Black man, I'm referring to an imaginary, hyper-masculinist hero in Black cultural discourse, a constructed archetype of Black male perfection. It dates back as far as the 18th century. I mean, this figure has been reinvented and identified in the African-American cultural imagination with each generation. It is an invented and a fictional creation. Not to say that these people aren't real, not to say that these men aren't real. And also it's not to say that these aren't men who often aspire to having status because of their genuine love for Black humanity. I'm talking about men who are civically and socially minded and working hard to dismantle demeaning representations of Black men as lazy, shiftless, and indifferent. So this image is constructed to counter demeaning representations of Black men. This image of a strong Black man, we're talking about men who image of a man who wants to care for, protect, and provide for their children, seek to afford Black women the same sort of chivalrous love and respect that they assume is afforded to white women. But what I hope to unpack today is what Farah Jasmine Griffin refers to as the price we pay for such protection. From abolitionists to the talented 10th elite, to Natalie-attired civil rights protesters, to Black nationalists, to hip hop moguls, the strong Black man, in the words of Duke University cultural critic Mark Anthony Neal, it constitutes a functional myth upon which we imagine our Black nation can be built. So this is one of the reasons that I assigned and wanted you to read as a pre-reading the famous 1961 debate between Malcolm X and James Baldwin. Here you have two geniuses, two towering intellectuals, both committed to combating Black oppression. And during their debate, they were debating the virtues of nonviolent mass demonstrations taking place throughout the South at the time, particularly led by the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Malcolm X pulls no punches. He says in the debate, he says, one of the reasons that the Honorable Elijah Muhammad is teaching us here in America, he's given us a solution that differs drastically from the sit-in movements because he's trying to make us men. I get sit-ins. And I get what it describes. It describes them correctly, he says, because the name describes its nature. It's a passive thing. Malcolm says pretty dismissively. And of course, Malcolm keeps up this rhetoric for the next few years. I mean, in his 1964 address, The Ballot of the Bullet, it's there that Malcolm states, we suffer political oppression, economic exploitation, and social degradation, all of them from the same enemy. The government has failed us. Anytime you're living in the 20th century, 1964, and you're walking around here singing, we shall overcome, the government has failed you. And that's what's wrong with you. You do too much singing. And to the laughter and applause of everybody, he says, today it's time to stop singing and start swinging. You can't sing on freedom, but you got to swing up freedom. And then he refers to his dear friend, the boxing legend, Cassius Clay, soon to be Muhammad Ali. And he says, Cassius Clay can sing, but singing didn't help him become the heavyweight champion of the world. Swinging helped. A coward can sit. An old man can sit. An old woman can sit. That right there castrates you. It's time for us today to start doing some standing and some fighting. But it's in that debate in 1961 that how does Baldwin respond? He says, I don't agree that sit-ins are necessarily passive. I think that it demands an extensive amount of power. But we'll get to that later, because what comes clear in their debate, this isn't about their philosophy of protest. It's about their conceptions of manhood. Because there are some things, there are some assumptions, there's some realities, there's some descriptions, there's some definitions of manhood that Malcolm X, like so many of us today, just takes for granted. Assumptions that were passed down to him, I'm talking about Malcolm, assumptions that were passed down to him by his Baptist minister father, Earl Little, and his Garveyite mother, Louise Little. Assumptions that obscure the many ways that African-American men willfully engage and purposefully influence notions of domesticity and gendered conceptions of what it means to be moral subjects. And these are assumptions that when we leave these assumptions unnamed, particularly in our religious spaces, we authorize a gendered status quo. And we limit the myriad of ways that Black people might show up for the cause of justice, freedom, and equality for all people. It's a certain worldview. It's a certain worldview that I've started to call Afrophallic Protestantism. Afrophallic Protestantism. It's a particular form of masculinized, largely evangelical Christianity. It's operative within historically Black churches and denominations. I use the term phallic here because it's signifying male privilege, but it speaks to the interests of both Black men and Black women in promoting particular gender ideologies, which are assumed to promote power and privilege for all people. But the conceptual framework is tied to the relationship between freedom and manliness. And manliness is tied to a certain intellectual and aesthetic disciplining of the body. Where does it come from? Well, I trace its roots. That it's an original counteroffensive against white masculinist terror during slavery. The struggles for Black emancipation were trapped in a conceptual, Black people, Black men were trapped in a conceptual web of contestation with Black manhood. Many early race men, they interpreted the social and civic death experienced by slaves as to be a symbolic castration of Black masculinity. Why? Because chattel slavery, it precluded African-American men from adapting what they viewed as the masculine standards of American patriarchal values. So naturally, Black men were frustrated by their inability to protect women and children from physical and emotional abuse of white male domination. At the same time, Black men still viewed white masculinity and its egregious patriarchal domination as an authoritative ideal of manhood. Therefore, ever since emancipation, Black men have wrestled with this paradoxical relationship to white masculine power that's grounded in both disdain, a hatred of it, and an emulation, wanting more of it. You hate it and you want it all at the same time. Let's consider the most popular Black male voice of the 19th century, Frederick Douglass. Anybody who's ever read his autobiographies, whether it's The Narrative Life or My Bondage and My Freedom, we learn that Douglass first identifies as a slave according to his account, he identifies as a slave first during a moment of perverse sexual violence. He is literally trapped in a closet. And while as a little boy trapped in a closet, he witnesses the overseer, Aaron Anthony, savagely whipping his Aunt Hester. And for Douglass, Anthony represents both his slave-holding father, his white father, his white racial self, while his aunt represents his Blackness and his bondage. That's how he narrates his account. And so to identify with his aunt and thus acknowledge his own reality of enslavement is, according to his own testimony, embracing an emasculated subjectivity under white masculine domination and control. And so from an early age, Douglass's existence is situated racially, sexually, and along these gender lines, along this binary with whiteness, manliness, and power on the one hand, freedom, and Blackness, femininity, impotence, and servitude on the other hand. This is the reason that when Douglass attains his freedom, that he describes it in this way. Personal independence is the soul out of which comes the sturdiest of manhood. Now, this is, again, Douglass, he has incredible moments where he understands the struggle for manhood is directly related to the full equality of women. He understands that at moments. But he also did little to unhinge his own conception of masculinity from the doorframe of freedom. Masculinity and freedom go hand in hand. And despite offering his aunt, his grandmother, his half-sister, and several other women early in his autobiographies as representatives of enslaved life, if you read his books, when you follow it, all of the women are at the beginning of the books when he is enslaved. Only one out of the 53 chapters in Douglass's final autobiography acknowledge a positive female influence. That's why the great Literary scholar Jenny Francho, she puts it this way. She says, in Douglas's autobiographies, one knows women in slavery and you know men in freedom. And this is the social context in which Douglas came to embody freedom. And we have this projection and creation of this strong Black man in the 19th century. But Douglas isn't alone. I mean, David Blight argues in his Pulitzer Prize-winning biography of Douglas that you can't ever underestimate the influence of the King James Bible on his thinking and the influence of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. Douglas gives voice to the rational, the literate, the independent conceptions of manhood circulating within Afro-Protestant culture. From 1840 to the Civil War, manhood was defined as individual enterprise, competitive success, power over others dominated. That's what dominated the literature of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. Bishop Daniel Payne, for example, his resolution to elevate the educational standards toward cultivating a well-educated ministry at the 1844 General Conference, where he decried against uneducated ministers and women seeking to enter the ministry. And for Daniel Payne, for the bishop of the AME Church, both were threats to the Black Christian community and Black liberation. Being uneducated and being feminized were threats to the Black church and the role of the preacher. This is this Afro-phallic Protestantism that I'm talking about. This is this culture that so many of us were raised in, nurtured in, and just simply take for granted. Or as put by Henry Highland Garnett in 1843 in his famous address, "Look around you, men. Look around you, brothers. Behold the bosoms of your loving wives, heaving with untold agonies. Hear the cries of your poor children. Remember the stripes your fathers bore. Think of the torture and disgrace of your poor mothers. Think of your wretched sisters, the loving virtue, as they're driven into prostitution and are exposed to the unbridled lust of the incarnate devils." What we see here is a Christianity constructed image of Black masculinity that has to protect, that has to take on a form of hyperaggression and violence on the one hand to combat this kind of docility and sense of accommodation on the other hand. But yet one can't play too much into the stereotypes circulating around Black culture. So therefore one has to do it in such a way where one is literate, learned, moral, self-disciplined, and thus a Christian strong Black man. And this is the historical context that has bequeathed us generations of this strong Black man. I would say today it's understandable, historically understandable, and still ethically inappropriate. So what are the implications? And then I'll open it up for conversation. What are the implications? Well, first of all, it establishes and reaffirms narrow conceptions of masculinity in general and in leadership in particular. It establishes what Patricia Hill Collins famously calls hegemonic masculinity. These are the features of this kind of dangerous hegemonic masculinity that then shapes and creates a hegemonic femininity. Includes being opposite of that which is rendered feminine, having control over, domination, bringing things into submission, having control over women, girlfriend, wife, daughter, children, not being confused for a boy or anything but representative performances of that which would be deemed as heterosexual. For to be a real man in American society means to conform one's identity to these socially constructed and these narrow categories, categories that undercut emotion, tenderness, empathy, and the myriad of expressions of healthy male love, desire, and interconnectedness. So that's the first thing. The second thing is it places an unrealizable burden on Black people, on Black men. There are two ways to dehumanize Black people. The two ways to dehumanize Black people. The first way is the one that most Black folk are most familiar with. And that's to presume that Blackness is always and already intellectually deficient and morally deviant. That's the lie that justified slavery, segregation, all kinds of contemporary forms of exclusion. We know that form of dehumanization really well. But the other way to dehumanize Black folk is to presume that Black folk must always be superhuman, that we've always got to be poised, polished, and perfect, that we're all Black men. If we're going to be successful, then we got to be T'Challa. We got to act like we're from Wakanda. We never hurt. We never bleed. We're never vulnerable. But that's just as dehumanizing as rendering Black folk always and already deviant is to render Black folk, Black men, and or Black women always and already strong. I mean, in fact, we have scientific evidence that both the strong Black man and strong Black women motifs, it contributes to adverse health outcomes. Most of us, we talk regularly about the impact on poverty on health and equity. We know those statistics well. But more recently, researchers are shedding light on the physical tolls of Black success, of strong Black manhood and or strong Black womanhood. Due to the increased exposure to racial discrimination among African Americans who penetrate professional levels, rates of depression, hypertension, and heart disease are higher. And that's why public health researchers are calling this condition John Henryism. They're named after the steel-driving Black folk hero. Y'all recall John Henry, the story? Defeated a steam-powered drill through the side of a mountain. But as soon as he won the race, he dropped dead on the spot. Being the strong Black man, he stuck it to the white folk, and it literally killed him. And if this, I'll park parenthetically and just say, if this was the impact of racism, discrimination, hypermasculinity on John Henry, God only knows what was happening to all the Jane Henrys of his world. Mothers, wives, daughters. Jane Henry, she's racing the dueling drills of racism, sexism, patriarchy, twice as hard as John for half the pay and little of the acclaim. So my wife Cecily put it in one of her books. John Henry may carry the hammer, but Jane Henry is the one who carries the load. So finally, what do we do? What can we do? Well, the first thing is what I've hoped to do with you here today. And that is demystifying logics by explaining and interrogating and showing that there's nothing natural about these images that we have in our community. There's nothing natural about our presumptions, including associations that every time we see men gather together in suits, that it represents strength, that it represents resilience, that it represents power, and that it doesn't represent words that we didn't see at the outset of this talk: vulnerability, fragility, insecurity. Whether it's the men in Memphis, whether it's Martin Luther King Jr. and his fellow male clergy members, or whether it's Teddy Bear. Thinking of a Martin Luther King Jr. shot dead at the age of 39 on the autopsy. He's smoking 2 packs of cigarettes a day. He's clinically depressed. And according to the autopsy, he has the heart of a 75-year-old at the age of 39. Power, strength, resilience, yes. At what price? So that's the first thing we do. First thing we do is let's unpack and interrogate our assumptions. And then also let's diversify the voices that we cite and we credit when we think about leadership. When we think about a Fannie Lou Hamer and an Ella Baker, we think about Sister Ella Baker on the right, her admonishment that strong people do not need strong leaders. We think about Fannie Lou Hamer, imprisoned in Mississippi, takes beating all night long in a jail cell from 2 imprisoned Black men whose life was threatened if they didn't beat and whip her and kick her all night long, and she endured that. What kind of counter story does that offer to Brother Malcolm's otherwise very anemic descriptions of nonviolent protest? We can cite folks like Pauli Murray raising her voice against Jim and Jane Crow, as well as the logics of heterosexism. Yet Pauli Murray modeled an altruistic embrace of all humanity, as Pauli Murray writes in American Credo: when my brothers try to draw a circle to exclude me, I shall draw a larger circle to include them. Because the logics of our protests should not have to always and already be contestation to have power and domination over. Or, as you read in James Baldwin's very, very thoughtful response to Malcolm, when James Baldwin says, what's at issue for me here is Malcolm X wants us to act like men, I'm quoting. And that seems to be one of the things I object to here, because I don't think that the fact that white people have done what they've done, that's something I want to emulate. Patrick Henry is not one of my heroes. I'm sorry, Baldwin says. But I think when I talk about standards, I say they've all got to be revised. And this is one of the standards that has to be revised. I don't think a warrior is necessarily a man. It's very difficult to be a man. And what it involves for me is an ability to look at the world, and whatever it is, in whatever shape it's in, and to deal with it, to face it, even if it means laying down your life. My friends, we can change the narrative. If we stop taking the narrative for granted. And help others to see that there's alternative ways, that there's alternative voices, that there's alternative conceptions of what it means to be responsible human beings. Let's open it up for some questions.
Wow, thank you so much, Dean Walton. That was a powerful talk. We welcome you all to add your questions in the chat, and I will ask them to Dean Walton as a part of the conversation. You know, some of the things that I was thinking about as you were speaking were about how we bring this conversation into the 21st century with the modern day activists, right? The Black Lives Matter movement is led by Black women and Black queer people. They may not always be at the forefront visually though still, right? We still have these visual representations of Black leaders as male. So I'm curious about how we think about and trouble or question our understanding of freedom in the 21st century with examples like the Black Lives Matter movement that were led by Black queer people. And also I'm thinking about Say Her Name, that's also led by a Black woman.
I mean, that's what's so beautiful and important about the Black Lives Matter movement, right? The way that it disrupts traditional narratives, but it also disrupts traditional frameworks and theories and prevailing conceptions about what leadership should look like, but also what it should be and what its end goals should be. Right? And that begins with the very bodies and subjectivities of those who understand themselves as leaders, and leaders being differently defined, right? It's not a conception of leadership, right? It's not a conception of leadership that flows from, as it did say from Martin Luther King Jr. in the Ebony magazine column, from the pulpit to the pews. But it's a conception of leadership that flows from and out of the doings and sufferings of everyday people in all of the complexities of everyday people, right? And that is men, women, transgendered, queer, same gender loving, you name it, all of the varying complexities and beauty, the beautiful patchwork of quilt of difference that constitutes Black life, right? Are all sites and sources of service to the cause of freedom and liberation.
So I think what I'm hearing from you is that we can look for leadership and like, we don't have to just think about leadership in the traditional way of it being the pastoral leader, but leadership is representation across.
That's exactly what I'm saying. And it's also making sure that and really it's just about our narratives keeping up with our realities. Because our realities and the practices, the everyday practices of folk are much better than the stories we tell in our professions quite often, right? When I say our professions, I'm talking about the things we proclaim, the stories that we share with each other, right? Because it's always been the case that, for example, that Black women have been the tail that has wagged the dog male ecclesiastical leadership, right? So that's nothing new. That's always been the case, right? So it's nothing new that's going on with this particular current generation, but it's a refusal to play particular roles, right? In order to maintain these kind of stock characters that fit our stories, that fit our truncated parochial provincial storylines.
So we have a question in the chat. What are your feelings on trans masculine and cisgendered men coming together to discuss this narrative?
I'm absolutely embracing it, right? And so so that's the very unpacking, right? The very unpacking of particular forms of Black masculinity that unfortunately aren't making room for so many of our trans brothers, sisters, and non-gender identifying, right? Non-gender conforming, right? And so we have room, we create room at the table, right? But to do that, then sometimes you have to make space, and you have to make space by dismantling old tropes.
Can I be just slightly controversial though? I think we also have to trouble or challenge trans people and people who are non-gender or gender non-conforming, because many times they endorse traditional masculinity norms, right? And kind of in some ways they're transgressing it, right? Because they are not conforming to the sex that they were born into and emulating different gendered behavior. But oftentimes in doing that, they also, not everyone, but many tend to reinforce the traditional kind of masculine behaviors or traditional feminine norms, right? By in a way, and as a way to embody that that identity.
Well, I mean, I wouldn't consider myself one in a position to make that particular critique. What I would say is that we know that sexism often knows no gender, right? We know white supremacy often transcends race, right? And so the reason that, for example, that I was talking about Afro-phallic Protestantism, because what I was suggesting was that this is a particular logic of which both men and women readily embrace as a means of power, right? And so this is the dynamic that we see with white supremacy, right? White supremacy can be operative. We can just have all Black people or people of color in the room. Let's just say we have a Latinx, African-American, Asian-American identities in the room. White people aren't even present. And guess what? White supremacy can be present in terms of the ways that we view one another and the ways that we react toward others based upon particular conceptions of white supremacy that have informed how we think they view us. And so that's why these are logics that operate and discourses that operate independent of us. And then they take root in our daily behaviors.
Yeah, so I think there was a question in the chat, are they reinforcing or using buffer protection? And I think it's both, right? So in some of the research that I've done in my work, I interviewed Black gay men about their experiences in churches and, whether they went to traditionally Black churches that were non-gay affirming or went to predominantly Black gay affirming churches, went to predominantly white gay affirming churches, or chose not to go to church at all. And many of the strategies that they used, were similar across the churches, right? So if you were to go, some of the strategies were, I may be in a traditionally Black church that's not gay affirming, but I will be there and own my Black male gay identity, but I will be in a monogamous relationship and get married to a person. so that I'm still conforming to some norms, societal norms, and so I can be acceptable, right, in society, and combat the stereotype against me being promiscuous, or hypersexual. And so there, what I'm saying is that example is one where you're reinforcing these norms about that come from white evangelical Christianity, that we're supposed to be in these monogamous relationships, and that you're enacting certain norms around masculinity, but at the same time, you're also transgressing it because you're pushing back against the norms about it being a heterosexual relationship. So that was just an example of where I'm coming from with that. Yes, Shonda.
I see there are some other questions in the
Yes.
chat, but I am transgressing the boundaries by verbally asking my question. It's related to, it seems like you're describing, Dean Walton, a social construction of what's masculine and what's not, and these sort of categories that have been created that have been death-dealing for certain populations. What I'm thinking about is how connected these social constructions are to notions of sin, right? So in religious communities, unless you act like a man, right, or train him up in the way he should go, the kind of things that we hear in different kinds of congregations, there's a connection to not being pleasing to God or being sinful. So I'm trying to figure, when we say we got to dismantle some of this stuff, I wonder if you have any notions about how to start with that, especially when notions of sin are intertwined in that.
Particularly when there's such a, informed by Pauline theology, that there is such violence and brutality done against the flesh, right, in the name of God, in general, writ large. So if you have a society that has embraced a theological framework where the flesh is inherently evil, well, what does that mean in a society that is structured in varying forms of dominance? And that dominance and the hierarchy is ordered by different conceptions of the flesh, whether that flesh is Black, whether that flesh is feminine, whether that flesh is quote unquote effeminate, right? And so it's that varying level, it's those levels of hierarchy that then compound these conceptions of sin that are already pervasive in the theological framework. And so therefore we have to begin to ask ourselves the question, who told you that, right? And so that's where I think where we appeal to other sources, okay? Like a Toni Morrison and Baby Suggs and Beloved, right? Called but unanointed, called and anointed, but uncalled, unordained, not sanctioned by any ecclesiastical clerical body, but she just led, according to Morrison, with her big heart. And she said, look at your hands, look at your skin, embrace and love yourself. Right? And it's these notions where we think that some sort of orthodox theological framework carries equal weight and equal merit in societies that are unequal, that are inequitable. And so another one I would give you, flesh is one. Another one is, I'm a fan of Reinhold Niebuhr. And for him, sin, cardinal sin, pride. But it's been incredible over generations to see the ways other minoritized scholars have pushed back on that, because the sin of particularly white males who have been in power, pride may be a chief sin, But for those who have been denied a voice and have been conditioned to believe that they are not worthy in the eyes of God, pride is actually not their sin. Their sin might be shame and hiding. So while God is calling some to cover themselves up because of their pride, God might be calling others to call them out and live into who God created you to be, beautifully, fearfully, wonderfully made. So thank you for that question, Dr. Jones. That's exactly, while we interrogate the social constructs, we interrogate the theological frameworks that they're linked to.
So we have a question from Janet Cordovez. I'm thinking about your earlier thoughts around racism, and that many times when we discuss racism, we discuss Black, Latinx, and Indigenous individuals and communities, but not colonialism, imperialism, and so forth. How do you lead this conversation at Wake Forest and with public health professionals in predominantly white spaces? How do you have this conversation about racism in predominantly white spaces?
Largely in the ways that we're doing right now, right? Whether it's in our classes, whether it's in public lectures, whether it's in our publications, whether it's in our dialogues and symposia and varying forms, right? This is what it means to be intellectually engaged in critical matters around race and gender and sexuality. And so I don't take that question lightly, and so I hope I'm not sounding dismissive at all, but exactly the very thing that we're seeking to do right now, right? That I never view this as a intra-racial conversation or an intra-racial dialogue, right? But this is actually intellectual engagement that we take in and out of every room we enter.
So I think what I'm taking from what you're saying, and I'm also trying to address the next question that I see, where do we begin to assist our communities to dismantle these processes? It sounds like what you're saying is we need to have these direct conversations to kind of question the assumptions that and the things that we've been taught and the assumptions that we've been making about the messages that we take for granted around masculinity and even conversations about sin. Is that right?
Absolutely, 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 absolutely.
It says, within Black communities, there's often a reluctance to engage frameworks that focus on power analysis. This is particularly the case with regard to arguments that erroneously pit the Black community and the LGBT community, LGBTQ plus community against one another. How would you suggest engaging those folks in conversations, recognizing their reluctance to have it at all?
Yeah. Number one, is taking place. Okay? And I want to affirm that. And I also want to affirm that for everybody who is on this call, right? Because all of the people who are on this call and all the people who are watching this, you're leaders in your communities. And by virtue of the fact that you're here, you're involved, you're engaged in these conversations, and these conversations are taking place. They may not be taking place in such a way that they're flowing from the pulpit to the pew on Sunday morning at 11 o'clock, but they're taking place after church. They're taking place on Zoom calls. They're taking place in living rooms. They're taking place at the comedy shows when you go see the comedians, in the beauty shops and the barber shops. And so that is why it's important to be informed in our conversation, right? So that we don't just always allow just kind of old wise tales and old folk wisdom that sometimes can be just as harming, as damaging as anything else to rule the conversation when it's taking place. But so I'm saying that I'm pushing back a little bit to say that while we understand that it may not be, some may not want to center these conversations, it doesn't mean that it's not happening. And we can create the spaces for it to happen. We are creating spaces. You are creating the spaces for it to happen.
I was reading an article earlier today about that very question. We're constantly framing Black churches as inherently homophobic, and that's not necessarily true. Especially over the last 10 years, we've seen a growth in predominantly Black gay affirming churches, and we've also seen, that there was some work that comes out of University of Alabama where they surveyed faith leaders and then also lay members of the churches. And you saw that the faith leaders had a perception that their congregations were more conservative than they actually were, and were afraid to have these conversations about sexuality and queer conversations. But the congregations, when they were surveyed, wanted to have those conversations and were more open and more liberal in their thought processes. And so a lot of times what's happening is a narrative, right? That the narrative is continuing that we are homophobic in Black churches, but that may not necessarily be the case. And to your point, these conversations are happening outside of the church and outside of the pulpit. And so I'm wondering if one step in that process is to empower faith community members to push their faith leaders, and to also present this information to the faith leaders to say, hey, you're not, your community is ready for this, right? They're not afraid to have this conversation.
No, and this is true. Everything that you said is true, absolutely. And I also want to I'll just say this from the other side, that there's fear. Fear immobilizes all of us. All of us are guilty of it, and fear also gets and arrests the imagination of faith leaders, because often they can become easy targets, right? And when I say easy targets, what I'm suggesting is that those who lead the conversations and those who seem like they get out front, right, of these, then people who are not, and there's always elements that are not happy, are not pleased about disrupting the status quo, right? Well, if they can't take it out on, or if they can't threaten people in the pews next to them, then the person who serves in a leadership position can become an easy target. Mm-hmm. And so I just want to suggest that dynamic does happen too, right? So because it's easy for us to say, and it's oftentimes we can fall into the trap of demonizing religious leaders for fear and moral cowardice, right? And rail against them. But we know that there are cases where livelihoods have been lost, mm-hmm. right, due to these difficult conversations. And so I just want to name that as well.
Yeah, for sure. When we consider demythologizing the myth of the strong Black man, my concern would be the tendency to not stop at the myth, but to run headlong into the destruction and harm of the Black man, to hold him responsible for his placement in society and in socio-historic stature, and then to judge and even condemn the Black man rather than the racial construct for his being, his identity, and his integral self. Woo! Y'all are coming with it today. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What do you say to that?
2 ways to dehumanize Black folk. always and already one thing or the other. That was exactly the point that I was seeking to make earlier. And so I don't disagree with that point either way. But I also want to be clear that the price of my redemption, the price of my humanity, and to affirm my humanity, the price I pay for that can't be a lie, because that's too high of a price. That's just too high of a price for any of us.
I think I'm not sure I understand your point about the price you pay for your humanity can't be a lie. What does that mean?
In order to defend my humanity against those who dehumanize me.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That when I say that it can't be a lie, the defense of that I'm not a devil. Well, then it can't be I'm not a devil because I'm a God.
Mm-hmm.
That's too high of a price, because that's another form of dehumanization.
Okay. So you can't go to either extreme. You can't.
That's
Yeah.
what I was saying. Those are the two ways of
Pressure on either
dehumanizing.
side.
That's too much pressure. That's
Yeah. You have to allow for flaws.
right.
Mm-hmm.
Black excellence is too high of a price. Right? The demand that we all be excellence 24/7. That's too high of a price for anybody to pay in order to combat structures of exclusion.
Yeah, and what ends up happening is a big part of the dehumanization of women and LGBT members in the Black community is because we have these high standards of excellence and perfection in our community and wanting to be respectable. And if you do not conform to, I guess these like purity politics, then you are continuing the stereotypes about Black people being sexual and not conforming to the societal norms, right? So that,
and again, and to the person who asked the question, I want to concede the fact that I get it. I understand that, right? But they can be two sides of the same dehumanizing coin, right? And so therefore, we just want to. What I'm just suggesting is that we resist either one of those extremes.
Yeah.
So that we can just be human too. We can be noble, brilliant, and we can be flawed and fragile. We can be strong and we can be vulnerable. We can be righteous and we can be heathen sometimes, because that's what it means to be beautifully human and passionately human.
Thank you. Does anybody else have any other questions? We are launching our post-survey poll. Well, we thank you, Dean Walton, for your insights and for answering all of these questions. We had a very active attendee community today who were really holding all of us accountable for the conversations that we're having. And I hope that these were helpful for you all in thinking about ways to challenge some of the norms and things that we take for granted in our work, and use these as tools to be able to have conversations with faith leaders and with your communities. So please make sure that you take this poll. and so that we can get some feedback from you all. And we certainly appreciate everyone for all the time and energy and effort that you put into attending these workshops. Thank you, Dean Walton.
Thank you. Thank you.
Have a good evening.